Me today to talk about television, violence, and behavior are Paul M. Hirsch, who is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Business at the University of Chicago, Charles R. Berger, who is a professor of communication studies and the director of the Communication Research Center at Northwestern University, and Robert Kuby, who is a doctoral student in the Committee on Human Development of the Department of Behavioral Sciences at the University of Chicago. Welcome, Bob. I always think the University of Chicago creates long and involved names for its departments to make the rest of us feel inadequate.
That may be so, I don't know.
A little bit of marketing. Paul, I'd like to begin with you because you seem to have the strongest opinions on this. Does television create violence, violent behavior?
I think we have absolutely no way of knowing, and that whatever statistical evidence we have available and that I've looked at and examined suggests that we're just looking for trouble and not finding it. It's a moral issue. You either like or don't like what you see on TV. We have a Puritan heritage. People think it's wasting our time. That may all be true, but I get very concerned, as you have picked up, when people try to show a direct kind of scientific white coat association between watching Columbo and then reading the newspaper the next day.
Or watching Columbo and going out and committing a crime. Or hitting your neighbor when you have an argument over the water hose in the backyard. And you say none of that is true, that there's no clear proof at all. The
studies that I've done show that people who do not watch television show up higher on measures of things like alienation and fear than people who watch television 5, 6, 7 hours a day.
Charles, you answered that one. I'm not sure that alienation and fear are violent. They may be very passive, alienated people.
Well, it is kind of interesting, though, because the data that Paul's talking about, it seemed to come into some conflict with some of the cultural indicators, things that have been done at the Annenberg School of Communication.
Yeah, it was a reanalysis of the same data.
You have to explain that for the uninitiated.
Right. Their original conclusions were that, in fact, people who were heavy consumers, what they called heavy consumers of television, were less trusting, more fearful that they would be involved in a violent or be attacked. Right? Wasn't that it? And so
yeah, what we found was that TV was essentially more of a solution than a problem for people who were home all the time, elderly, retired, unemployed, housewives. They're the ones that have it on the most.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, if you're at home, you can have it on. Though that, of course, does not tell you whether or not the person is watching it.
Absolutely.
It can be on, and the recorders can record that it's on, and in fact, no one's seen it in an hour.
Nor whether if they're fearful or alienated, it's because they were home and had the TV on.
Interesting notion. Though I would say the original Annenberg findings, I've seen that as well, report that people who watch TV think that there are criminals out there and they're going to be hurt all the time. Certainly one would learn that from television. On television, people are getting attacked and robbed and beaten up regularly and often. And Charles, you said?
Right. Well, I would, I think that Paul's right in some respects, in the sense that certainly no one study is going to probably be a definitive kind of effort in showing a simple causal relationship between consumption of violent material on television and aggressive behavior, because probably it isn't a very simple causal relationship. But in other words, there are a number of mediating factors. But I think that there are enough data floating around, both in laboratory studies and in field research, to suggest that something's going on there. There is a connection, but it is indeed mediated by a number of other kinds of
like the rest of life, right? Bob, I know you've done research on what people do or how they feel about watching television. Tell me about that and where you stand in this argument.
Well, I literally stand right between them, I guess.
Right, clearly planned on our part.
Well, television watching behavior is exceedingly complex, and as I think both Paul and Charles have suggested, we can't reduce it to one simple study or one simple conclusion. People are doing a lot of other things when they're watching television. Right now, we're on very early in the morning. I don't doubt that there are people right now who are listening to us while they're combing their hair in the bathroom, getting ready to go to work, or they've just come in from jogging, or they're eating breakfast.
Or the nursing mother phenomenon. I always think we have the nursing mother market wrapped up on early morning television.
It's probably true.
Half paying attention, in other words.
And many studies, or all studies really, virtually all studies, have neglected looking at the complexity of human behavior, which goes on at the same time that people are viewing. As regards what we have covered so far, one point I'd make about what Paul was saying about the correlation of low or no TV viewing and fear and alienation, and you suggested perhaps that these people were passively alienated. I think you'll find historically that many of the people who've committed assassinations and mass murderers are people who are often described as, gee, he's just the nicest guy, gee, I don't think he'd ever hurt anybody, and this person is often then blows up later on. So to suggest that alienation and fear are or are not connected, or is not connected to violence, could be a mistake.
Yeah,
could very well be.
I was being simple-minded. During the break, we're going to have to take a little break, and then I want to hear some more about your research specifically on what happens when we watch TV. We'll be back in a moment. Television and violence, and more generally about what we do when we watch television and what television does to us. Bob, you're quite right that I was being simple-minded in imagining that you could put violence on television like a product, like cornflakes, and have people watch it and kind of buy it emotionally and go out and replicate it, when it's not even clear that, it doesn't seem clear to me that people are unable to make the distinction between television and real life. Most of us can we not?
Oh, yeah. Years ago, I did a very informal study with children and of two ages. I think most of them were 6, and another group was 8. And I asked them whether violence on television was real. And most of them said, no, of course not. That's not. They knew it wasn't real. Now, but that's too simple-minded, too. Just because someone tells you that's not real, or I know that the Roadrunner really isn't, or that the coyote really isn't injured in those cartoons, we can't. It's exceedingly difficult, again, to assess what's going on at a subconscious or an unconscious level, and what it means to sit in front of a TV for such long periods of time and ingest such material over long periods of time. We don't know what it means.
Charles?
It's a good point, because a lot of studies that have been done, including a lot of the cultural indicators research, does rely on verbal reports. And there's a lot of...
That means what people tell you,
right, how they feel, whether they trust other people or whether they feel that they're going to be attacked and so on. And there's a mounting evidence in another area that's somewhat removed from this discussion, an area of social cognition, to suggest that people's verbal reports of mental processes, of their ability to process information, or how they go about processing information, to make social judgments and so on, is not very good. In other words, people may make judgments of various kinds about themselves and about others, but when you ask them to tell you how they did it, they may be influenced by factors that are totally outside of their conscious awareness, but yet they will indeed give you a verbal account that sounds plausible. So in responding to these questions, people may, it may give you plausible accounts, but they really can't describe what it is that influences them. So these kinds of effects can be very subtle.
Ironically, they may be learning from television that violence on television creates a violent society. Rather, you see what I mean? And then telling that account. If I went out and interviewed people, presumably they'd say, I don't like all that violence on television, and even though they probably watch it.
Oh,
Is that true?
That happens. I think we have a view of people out there as the movie Being There presented a fellow character named Chance, who sat in front of his TV set and got all of his views of the world from those programs, and had no other background, no other experience, no other moral kind of heritage from which to draw his own conclusions.
Even the construction, the people out there, is nonsensical, because of course we are, under other circumstances, the people out there. And when you watch television and watch violence, how do you feel about it?
My sense of it is that it's probably closer to the view that I've had a hard day and it's kind of nice to see some bad guy get his than this is awful for the world out there. My sense of television is that it's unfortunate to have people like us telling everybody out there what to do with their television sets, because the research evidence is not clear enough, in my judgment, to give them prescriptions on what they should and shouldn't do. If Jerry Falwell does it, he has the word from God, he thinks, and he'll go out and tell them what to do. But I don't think we can put on a white coat and tell folks, here's what having watched that program is going to mean for you. That's agreeing with Charles.
I don't think, certainly not
Over the long run, it may do anything, but we can't really tell you yet.
Well, certainly in the individual case, you have no business going out and telling people that, just by virtue of the kind of data that they're collected in these studies.
But come on now. I realize that you're saying that you three, I'll accept myself from this for the time being, cannot, on the basis of science, tell people what they should and should not watch, what they how much they should watch, because we don't have good data. Okay? And I will accept that. It's, in fact, charming and ingenuous for you to say in public that scientists don't know everything. I'm delighted to hear that. On the other hand, isn't it perfectly all right for all four of us, not as scientists, but as ordinary people, as the people out there, to say, this is a pretty horrible moral universe we're seeing on television, if violence is the center and core of the culture and all problems are solved with violence? Why can't I say that?
Well, I think the Falkland Islands is a horrible thing. I don't know that television created it, although it shows it on the news every night.
No, I would suspect that imperialism created it, but that's another argument.
Well, if there's crime in my neighborhood, I'm very loath to think that it's because some show on TV had crime in it. It would seem to me there are social conditions out there that are far more predictive and better accounting for what's going on than, as come back to your example.
I'm not asking that question. Not does TV violence cause crime immediately. I was asking a question about the moral universe that television presents.
See, I would take exception again to what you said, to suggesting that somehow television what's on television is morally corrupt or bankrupt.
We're on television being morally corrupt and bankrupt, I suppose. I keep thinking about the self-reflection involved here. Yeah.
I mean, first off, I would have to agree there is too much violence. Just as a personal opinion, there's too much violence on TV. But at the same time, if you look at the plot lines in dramas and in sitcoms, there's a very strong moral message conveyed in American TV. There always has been, and there is today. If you watch old programs, I happened to watch Andy Griffith the other day while eating lunch, and there's a very strong moral message in this program about the way that the little boy should relate to his aunt and how he should apologize. I mean, people are forever learning about their behavior and modifying it. Now, and violence usually, almost invariably in dramatic programs, the bad guy loses out. And, of course, then you could argue that this is pro-social programming. Most people say that this isn't pro-social to watch. In other words, it isn't good for the social fabric of the culture to be watching the Dukes of Hazzard or Columbo. But other people would say that, yes, it is, because it's showing that crime doesn't pay.
I think we have to talk some more about those moral lessons on TV when we come back. On television and what it might or might not do to us today on The Leading Question. And my guests are Paul M. Hirsch, who is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Business at the University of Chicago and sort of pro-TV this morning. Charles R. Berger, professor of communication studies and the director of the Communications Research Center at Northwestern University. And Robert Kuby, who is a doctoral student getting his PhD in the Committee on Human Development of the Department of Behavioral Sciences at the University of Chicago, who experiments on people who watch television. A fair statement. I had gotten completely engrossed in the conversation here because it seemed to me we'd moved a long way from whether violence sells violence to the question of the moral order presented on television. Charles, you're the only one who didn't kind of contribute a statement on that. Do you like what's going on television in terms of the lessons being taught?
Well, I think, let me put it this way, I think that television programming affords people the opportunity to perhaps, if you talk about it in terms of children watching television, let's say, I think it affords the opportunity for adults, if they so choose, and I hope a lot do, to reinforce certain kinds of themes based upon shows that their children see. I'm afraid that for very young children, though, that especially children who are younger than the ages you previously talked about, who can't distinguish fantasy from reality very well, for example, get down into the kindergarten ages, who who have a problem distinguishing, who attribute human qualities to inanimate objects and so on. There's for some sort of Piagetian kind of work. At that point, I think you have to be concerned about what's on television. And at that point, too, I think it may become fairly critical, perhaps, for parents to, if younger, very young children are going to watch that kind of fare, to be there to somehow augment and explain what's going on there, making distinctions between fantasy and reality and so on. But I think
between
that,
commercials and the show, insofar as there is a distinction.
There are data to suggest, for example, not in the area of violence so much, but that in advertising on cartoon shows for products that are aimed at children, that children cannot understand the caveats that are introduced into those. Batteries not included.
Right.
When the children don't, the young children,
assembly required.
Some assembly required.
That's my favorite.
And so on. Children, very young children, just don't understand what that means.
But are you convinced that adults understand what it means?
I'm not all adults. There are certainly there are soap opera actors and actresses who have related stories where they have been walking down the street, let's say in New York, where adults have come up to them and treated them, they've attacked them. If they're the villains, they've treated them. These adults can't distinguish between fantasy and reality, obviously, because they can't treat these people as actors or actresses. They treat them as a soap opera character, even when they see them on the street. Now, that doesn't happen frequently. Anymore.
But
it happens with adults too, you know. Because this whole controversy about Ed Asner and Lou Grant has fascinated many people of recently, and it occurs to me that I have a little trouble sometimes separating, you know.
Oh, me too.
It happens to professors with students. Because you see someone in the supermarket, my gosh, what are you doing out of the classroom? And vice versa.
My students always seem surprised that I'm not locked up in a file cabinet overnight, that I have a kind of persona outside of that classroom. And with Ed Asner, me too. I am firmly convinced that Mrs. Pynchon is a real person, and then when that series goes off the air, that I will personally miss her. Right? So I'm not sure that I agree with your distinction that, well, kids are impressionable, adults are not. Does television sell behavior as well as it sells soap? I mean, are we learning to behave from what we see on TV?
I think that it's much more difficult to describe what behavior is being sold during the 22 minutes that surround the commercials.
Right.
That the commercials might tell me to buy one brand of toothpaste over another, and they're directed to do that.
Right.
Because the programs are about anything. And I think it would be much more difficult for an ad agency to take credit for whatever behaviors went on in those 22 minutes than for the 30-second breaks. But I want to share Charles' sense of drawing a distinction between adults and children, because in my pro remarks of a few moments ago, I was clearly speaking of research about adults, and I was suggesting that there's not a great deal of concern that the research I've seen would allow for that.
Yeah. Now, luckily, Charles will be back with us tomorrow with two other guests who are real specialists in children's television, and will address on the leading question specifically some of the research on children. It does tend to suggest that children are more impressionable. Most children are more impressionable than most adults. Is that fair?
I think that's fair.
I think the research on adults is less ambiguous than the research on children.
More ambiguous, maybe.
Yeah, with children it might go either way. But with adults, I don't think there's any reason to show great concern.
Interesting. That means, of course, that we're not, in doing what we're doing, we're probably not influencing anybody either, which kind of depresses me. I like to think that we are. We'll be back in a moment. To go on. Watching television. Welcome back. Bob Cupey, you study what people are feeling and thinking and doing when they're watching television. What are people feeling and thinking right now when they're watching us?
Well, they're feeling and thinking different things in very general terms. they are, particularly in the evening now, because again, some of those people are out there getting ready for work, and they're active. But generally, when you come home from work and you watch in the evening during prime time, people are very passive and very relaxed. As passive and relaxed as any activity they engage in. We know this from self-reports that we gather from people while they're engaged in activities. We signal them with a radio device, and they tell us what they're feeling, thinking, and so forth. People, when they're watching TV, if they're very focused on the set, I'm currently working with the idea that TV can induce an altered state of consciousness, akin, and this that's a big set of words, altered state of consciousness, but akin to daydreaming or hypnosis, where one feels somewhat different, and one feels relaxed and passive and sort of spaced out sometimes when they watch TV. These are very common reports. Parents say their children look like zombies when they watch TV. At the same time, you may not be attending that carefully to the TV set. You may be lying on the couch looking at a newspaper at the same time, doing other things as well. And now TV may be less like hypnosis and more like daydreaming in some ways. You may be running through in your mind while you're watching the TV, what happened earlier in the day, how I'm going to solve that problem at work tomorrow, and you're not even doing it on a very conscious level. So here I'm saying there are two different kinds of entirely different kinds of cognitive processes which can go on at the time that a person's engaging in viewing.
And when people are watching us, hurried as they are in the morning, or listening to us, they may be picking up bits of information, but not getting into a state of altered consciousness, I hope.
Right, but they may get it better than if they were.
Thanks for being with us this morning on The Leading Question. I found it absolutely fascinating. Thanks, all three of you. Thanks for being with us.